or we are recording.
We are live.
for the very first episode of Mountains and Men, the podcast. My name is Rhys Gadbois, and here with me
is Peter Myers.
Wonderful. Yeah. I think we're going to learn as we go.
Yeah, we'll get better at that.
We are currently recording in my garage with a destroyed, broken down washer behind Peter.
And just as everyone knows, if there's a moment in the podcast where we just kind of pause or one of us gets really distracted, it's probably because the lights went off and we have to turn the sensor back on.
Yeah.
So that could happen at any moment.
And it will happen. That is one thing that we will guarantee for this episode. So before we jump in to just talking about today's episode, or really what we're going to talk about during today's episode, we're just going to introduce ourselves since none of you know who any of us are. So like I said, my name is Rhys Gadbois. Rhys, like the peanut butter chocolate flavor. So a little bit about me. I'm from Seattle, Washington. After I graduated high school, I went to Ohio to study theology at Franciscan University of Steubenville. Met my wife there, got married, moved to Denver, and got a master's in theology at the Augustine Institute. That was a really good time. After 3 years out in Denver and teaching there for 2 years, moved out to Maryland, where I've continued teaching theology at local Catholic high schools. A little bit about me. I like hikes. I like rock climbing. I like doing cool stuff. I like longboarding. Do I longboard a lot? No, I don't. But yeah, I enjoy getting out, spending time with my family. And yeah, that's me.
Cool. Yeah. Thanks, Rhys. So I'm Peter Myers, like the famous saint, St. Peter. I was just trying to think of a funny thing to use since Rhys has that fun relation to candy, but wish I had something like that for my name. But
I don't even like Reese's.
I'm not a big peanut butter and chocolate person myself, actually. But
don't blame you.
But yeah, so I grew up in northern Kentucky, and my family moved to Maryland when I was 13, and I graduated from Towson University with a degree in accounting in 2016, and then spent the next 2 years actually working for Focus, the Fellowship of Catholic University Students, as an on-campus missionary up at MIT in Boston. And yes, that is the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, the -- college in America. And during that time in Focus, I discerned a call to enter seminary. And so I went to I was in seminary to become a Catholic priest for the Archdiocese of Baltimore for 4 years at St. Mary's Seminary and University in Roland Park, Maryland. And then just about a year and a half ago now, I discerned out of seminary with a lot of joy and peace, and I re-entered the accounting world after 6 years away. So that was an interesting experience and transition. But I now have my master's in theology, and I have been leading a Bible study for some of the guys in the local community who I know, including Rhys is in my Bible study, and that kind of ties into the story that we'll tell of how we began this, what led to us deciding to begin this podcast. So
yeah. No, dude, you starting that Bible study was clutch. Because I've just been moving around so much. Yeah. It's always been like, oh, you find community and then you bail and then you got to do it all over again. And I've got a family, so that's really difficult. But when our mutual friend, Matthew, connected us and got me involved with the Bible study, that was a serious answer to a lot of my prayers.
Yeah. And I mean, that Bible study came out of a prayer, really. I mean, it's something that I was very, when I was leaving seminary, I was very passionate about the idea of small group Bible studies from my time in Focus and just seeing how transformative they can be. And I was getting out and I was like, man, like we need this for men in the area. Like I know a lot of guys, like I had talked with our mutual friend Matthew about kind of the lack of like fraternity and friendship and among like men, and I think among women as well in the church, of course, but I can't personally do much about that. But just, that desire was there. And so I prayed about it, and, within a couple of months, I just felt this really clear sense that I needed to do that. And so it started small too. It was literally Matthew and I just met up at a Panera one night and talked about it and, discussed whether it would make sense to do this Bible study. And we were like, let's try it. And then he invited you and Jerome, and we've built from there. And now we have about, I think 8 guys kind of who in and out, because most of the guys are married and have families and,
right.
Have various different things. So there's usually only about 4 or 5 of us there, but there's about 8 guys who do participate at times. So
Yeah.
it's been really good.
No, it's a solid group. Yeah, that Panera knows us.
Yeah, for sure. We've definitely gotten to know the employees and like the people there.
We're always there to like right up until closing.
Yeah.
And they're always so sweet. But actually, as you were just kind of like riffing there, I thought of an episode for a podcast. So,
Nice.
so that was awesome. But yeah, no, I think things we'll talk about a lot is just fostering Catholic community and doing it on your own, which kind of seems contrary to the idea of community. But, good community does require some solitude, or some like time on your own.
Yeah.
But how do we find community? How do we foster it? How do we grow it? Maybe even how do we start it? And what does the good community look like? I'm looking forward to talking about those things. But yeah, let's kind of just jump into really how this podcast started. Do you want to tell the story, or
I think you can at least tell it all, interject if I have things
please
to
do.
say.
Yeah. So we were at Bible study. And this is one of those.
One of those ones I just mentioned, where there were only 3 of us there.
Exactly. Or a bunch of people just like, we cannot make it this week. My kids have soccer or whatever. But so it just ended up being
Max.
Yeah, right. Not calling anyone out here, but it just ended up being 3 of us. Okay, you, me, and Kenneth. So Kenneth. Without revealing too much about Kenneth was asking a lot of questions about Catholicism. Grew up Catholic, but he's been on like this awesome journey, I would say. And he's just asking a lot of cool questions, and he's being really open and really respectful, and he's awesome. And he was asking these questions, and you and I started trying to answer them.
Yeah, of course, as we like to.
Yeah, going back and forth. And we were kind of like doing pretty well, riffing off of one another, I would think. And Ken just kind of like looks at us and he's like, this should be a podcast. And then you and I just kind of like blew up. We're like, that's what I've always been wanting to do. And you're like,
yeah, I love that moment because we both just like, I feel like we both just stopped and just looked across the table at each other and we're like, dude, I've wanted to start a podcast for like a while.
Yeah.
And you're like, yeah, I have too.
Yeah.
I was just like, let's do it then.
Well, I think what was so pure about it was also that you and I kind of had this shared understanding of this podcast that it doesn't necessarily exist to go out to the masses.
For sure.
It's really an excuse for you and I to sit down and talk about things.
Yep.
You know what I mean? And I think that's what makes a good podcast.
Absolutely.
Is when you would do it whether or not anyone's listening.
Yeah.
But please listen. Okay.
Yes.
But no, and I'm really looking forward to getting this excuse to just sitting down, having one-on-one conversations with you, and also having guests on. And just,
exactly. Like to have conversations, even like what we had inadvertently, that conversation with Ken that night. And we do plan to have Ken on the podcast so he can talk about that himself. But just those experiences of, bringing a guest on too, and having the opportunity to just discuss something among us. They can ask questions. We can ask questions. It just gives that opportunity for free-flowing conversation, just like people coming together in that community that we're talking about trying to build.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No. And I mean, that's something that we're all kind of craving, and it's, even though we're so interactive with people nowadays, we feel more lonely than ever, honestly.
Absolutely.
And that just breaks my heart. For jealous reasons, obviously, because I want community. I desire it. I came from a great community at Franciscan, and I just want that for the rest of my life. I want it for my family. And I think this podcast will be an excellent avenue or an instrument into hoping to create that. Yeah.
For
so
sure.
with that being said, I think we can kind of get into talking about what this podcast will be about. We've been hinting at it. We've been making comments that describe the characteristics, but I think we could finally really jump into it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So do you want to? We'll just go back and forth.
Yeah, sure. You can start us off, though.
So the podcast title of Mountains and Men. Okay, I'm a big fan of the band of Monsters and Men. I've read the book of Mice and Men. I just like the title of something in men,
Yeah.
So it had to be an M word. Now, I love the mountains.
Yeah, as do I.
There are no mountains out here on the East Coast. There are some, okay? But when you grow up in Seattle and you drive to work or drive to school and you see Mount Rainier on the horizon, it just blows your mind. And when I moved to Ohio, that got taken away from me, and I really grew to appreciate it. But then I made the smart move and moved to Denver, where there are mountains, and my wife and I just constantly would go hiking in Rocky Mountain National Park. It was a blast, and then we decided to move to Maryland. Maryland.
Oh, Maryland.
Oh, Maryland, which has its own beauty. Okay. But you really gotta really look for it. You know what I mean? You just can't look out your car window on a sunny morning. But yeah, we love the idea of mountains, first of all, for like aesthetic reasons. But also, I remember studying theology at Franciscan. And in my freshman Bible class, Introduction to Biblical Studies, we learned that when God interacts with humanity and he makes a covenant with them and he establishes an intimate relationship with them, they take place on mountains. And the mountains are kind of these high points in our life where we feel close to God, where we're constantly striving for. And there's a passage in Psalms, can't remember the exact chapter. It's probably one of the more popular Psalms of all time. You could probably tell me about, we walk through the valley of the shadow of death.
Oh yeah, Psalm 23.
Psalm 23. Okay, yeah, I wanted to say that, but I didn't want to be wrong. I have a bachelor's and master's degree in theology, and I didn't know that. I mean, I knew it, but I didn't. But, we all are kind of born into this original sin, this brokenness, which we need to admit. We're broken individuals. You don't need to be Christian to acknowledge that. And we all strive for the mountains. We strive for the fulfillment of our existence, the fulfillment of our being. And that's where we meet God, at the high points in life. And this podcast is really here to talk about how we reach those mountains in our everyday life. Would you agree? Yeah,
absolutely. And I think playing off of that, for me, like I agree about all that, and I love the mountains. And one of the things that just came to my mind when you were talking about that is the concept of, like, in theology, there's two different things that they'll talk about of, like, in philosophy or theology, approaching something from the top down or the bottom up. And I feel like kind of just now you were talking about the top approach, like here's, the God of the mountains. And even like that great phrase in the Old Testament, one of the names for God, El Shaddai, quite literally, I think it's Hebrew, but it means like the God of the mountain. That's because that was where they met God, was on the mountains. And so that's why that phrase El Shaddai isn't just a name for God. It's actually just describing like where they would meet God. And at the same time, though, like we've talked about for this podcast that we want to do, I think in some ways I would view this podcast almost as like, which I tend to be more of a top-down theologian in my experiences, but at the same time, I think I almost want this to be more of the bottom-up approach, in the sense of viewing, like as you've talked with me about, viewing kind of that Aristotle, the great philosophers' approach to virtue, and understanding that like pursuing the good is something that all of us desire deeply inside of us, whether you're Christian or Muslim or Jewish or not practicing anything, we all have this inherent desire to pursue the good. And what is that good? We as Catholics, I think, would say that's God that we're pursuing.
Yes.
But I think most people would agree that they're pursuing some good in their life, that they're trying to live the good in some way. And so I think that's like one of the things that I want to get out of this, or kind of bring about in this podcast, is to just talk about what it means to live that good life, what it means to pursue the good.
So I really like that you said you're more of a top-down theologian, but we kind of want to move from the bottom to the top here.
Yeah.
So when you say move from the bottom to the top, by beginning at the bottom, does that mean talking about like first principles? Or not necessarily like explicitly in a metaphysical sense, but talking about how do I be a good person? Like just how do I be
exactly.
a good person?
I was going to say, I think it means a little bit more. I mean, sure, like definitely that would involve first principles, but maybe not explicitly, because I mean, we could both get into philosophy and theology for sure, and that might be beneficial to people, and we probably will cover that. But then more on a more basic level, in a sense, which is still kind of first principles, just in a slightly different sense, to focus on, like you just said, I think, like, what does it mean to live the good life? Like, and I guess what I mean by that, and this is something that I'm actually, I would say, have not always been the best at trying to bring across, but I think this could be a really good avenue between the two of us to do this, is like, how do we live in this current world that we live in? Because that was one of the things I encountered leaving formation for the priesthood. Was I was in seminary for 4 years and very removed from the world in a certain sense. And when I came out, and was like I looked around me and I was like, this world is nuts. Like, what the heck is going on?
You had like
here?
the Saint Benedict experience.
And so like one of the things that I've like had to struggle with the past year plus has been figuring out how to live in the world, but not of the world in like the best kind of way.
Yeah.
And I think that means seeing like, what does it mean to pursue the goods in our lives and why are those things good? We just talked about this recently at Bible study, actually, about how people have this tendency to, like art and like good art or good music or something.
Right.
You can have this experience where you're moved by a really beautiful piece of music or a really beautiful painting or something. And you're like, why? There's this part of you that kind of wonders like, well, why is this good? And that's kind of what I'm getting at, I guess, in a sense, is like, what makes it good? Let's talk about, in a certain sense, let's talk about like what these good things are. What is it that we do to pursue the good life? And then what makes those things good? Like that's one of the things I think of. I mean, there's tons of things we could talk about, but.
Yeah, I mean, we could, obviously this will involve going over current events, even maybe staying away from the more controversial ones, but simply talking about events and trying to maybe not tell people this is the good. And maybe if it's obvious, we'll obey, the Catholic teachings of right and wrong. But, we'll share in that struggle with trying to discern what is good in the difficult situations. Yeah.
Yeah, that's part of my thought for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, because like that concept of living in the world, being in it, but not of it. And it's a cliche we've heard over and over and over again.
Of course, yep.
But actually unpacking that and like, how does that actually look? Because there are a lot of people with different opinions on that. And we're not here necessarily maybe to just always come to a conclusion with every episode, but just to have an honest discussion about these ideas.
Yeah,
100%.
For sure. And I think that's something that, I think it's no secret that I think both of us in some sense have been a little bit inspired by like Matt Fradd's the last few years of how he does Pints with Aquinas and stuff like that. And I think that's one of the things is it's important like to both of us to talk about these things and to struggle with them is what I would say. And that's one of the reasons I want to have guests on too, is because we'll be able to get the perspectives of other people. And like, you and I may have very similar views on some of these things. Not that we're going to always agree, but we'll have very similar views on some of the stuff. But then we can bring another person in too who might have a very different view. Mm-hmm. And that could be really interesting to get that discussion out there and to see, okay, well, what does this person think? What do we think? And to live a little bit in that gray area almost, to your point about not always just having, sure, there's certain like moral black and whites on one level. But there's also a lot of things out there that are like, how do we actually like approach this aspect of the world or community or life or, whatever. And those are things that there might not be a clear answer to. Yeah. And that's where just discussing it is like helpful.
Yeah. And one thing is worth saying that you and I obviously know, but maybe our listeners don't, if we have any, we will adhere, you and I, to church teaching.
Oh, 100%. Yeah. Yes, absolutely. As Catholics who both have masters in theology and everything, I think we both have a very clear sense of the magisterium of the church being the governing body of the church, and that we will for sure follow all the teachings of the church in that. But then even in that's the thing where we'll follow the teachings of the church, but then there might be like lesser things that aren't like direct teachings of the church, but just like how do you live the Christian life well?
Of course. Yeah.
But yes, absolutely. That's important to clarify. I think that we are very much going to stay in line with the magisterium of the church.
Yeah. So to summarize, Of Mountains and Men is generally speaking, it is a podcast on how to live the good life, to how to live a life in accordance with the good, so we can arrive one day at the mountains and encounter God.
And I think it's important to note too, as you and I talked about in preparation for this, that while we love the title of Mountains and Men, and I think that just kind of came about because of both of our love for the mountains and the fact that we're both men and things like that, I do think it's important to kind of, not to be weird about it, but to make it clear that like, we're not doing this podcast to be some sort of men's podcast. This is designed to 100%. Just be a discussion podcast. I'm sure we will have women guests on. Like, we want this to be something that anyone in the Archdiocese of Baltimore, anyone in our local communities can listen to and can relate with and, have kind of participate in whatever ways they desire to.
Yeah, no, 100%. I'm really happy you said that. Obviously you and I agreed upon that before we started, but yeah, this is just because it has the title Men. Like, there's a bunch of Catholic men podcasts, which I'm sure are doing great things.
Yeah, there's a lot of Catholic men podcasts, and like, not to, those are great, but like, this is not that.
Yeah, it's not it at all. We want to be abundantly clear with that, despite the title. Like, it's men. much as I hate this phrase, in a gender neutral term. Gender neutral.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
the classical sense of like mankind. Yeah,
the way Aristotle speaks of man. Yeah,
Yep.
100%. So I think, I kind of want to keep going. I would like to talk.
Of course.
Yeah, I would like to talk a little bit more when it comes to living the good life. What are some categories that people would fall into throughout history of when they're trying to achieve that goal to live the good life? Because I think there are schools of thought out there on how to live the good life, and there are names for them. Like I honestly think of 3 categories.
Okay.
I think of the nihilist.
Okay.
Out there, which is there is no good, there is nothing, there's no purpose. And then there's the existentialist, which means there's no universal good necessarily, but there's an individual good, and we find fulfillment by trying to pursue that.
Yep.
And then I've never been particularly gifted at describing this one, but I would describe it's a religious idea of the good, not exclusively Catholic or Christian, obviously, but this idea that we all exist to serve God, or some religions would describe as the gods.
Yeah.
And I think that falls more in alignment with kind of what Aristotle would say, or maybe Plato would say.
Yeah.
Although I know they disagree a little bit on that understanding of the good. But I think we have the existentialist, the nihilist, the existentialist, and then maybe we could say the theist.
Oh yeah, I think maybe that's the right way to put it, actually. Yeah, because I would say the existentialist doesn't really have a sense of like God in the same way that a theist does. So yeah, I would agree with that, I think.
Yeah. So do we want to maybe talk about all 3 of those?
Sure. Think? Yeah.
Yeah. Where should we begin?
I mean, I would say begin from the bottom up in a sense. So begin with the nihilist. I don't mean that in an insulting way to nihilists, to be clear. I just mean that like, I feel like the nihilist is the nothing one. So that's kind of got the least, it's more this premise of just, you're starting at the bottom in a sense. And so that's where I would go with that.
Yeah. I think the nihilist, if they were a true nihilist, I think they would like, yeah, no, we're the bottom. Yeah, for sure. Like, yeah, start with us, please. So, so maybe we should define our terms.
Honestly. Yeah, that's what I was just thinking. Because even you saying that, even for me, I'm kind of like not totally sure what you mean by those.
By the term
terms.
Nihilist.
Exactly. Well, I mean, I kind of know, but yeah, I think it'd be helpful to get a more detailed.
Okay. So my understanding, I'm open for correction, 100%. Even people listening, if they send us a message.
Absolutely.
We're not sure how you will do that yet because we have no way of you sending us a message.
Will send it to whatever email we insert at some point.
Exactly. But from my understanding, the way to define nihilism is an ideology that subscribes to the belief that there is no reason for existing. And because there's no purpose for existence, there is no way to really direct our lives. There's no good, there's no evil, and that's it. And you just live your life kind of doing what you want, which obviously can separate into many other categories of hedonism.
So to be fair to the nihilist, though, I just want to. I think I agree with that generally. But what would you say? Because you kind of just described all the things that aren't there. What would you say are the things they have?
Okay, that's good.
Like, what are they pursuing in a sense? Because there must be something that they're pursuing, even if it's simply pleasure or something. But like, what are they pursuing?
From my understanding, and I'm really interested to hear your take on that. My understanding is, with nihilism comes some liberty, like not some, a whole lot of liberty. Because when you realize nothing matters and there's no reason for existing, you feel empowered because you can do whatever you want. Mm-hmm. Yes, people might be offended by your actions. They might be hurt by your actions. But if you subscribe to the idea that nothing matters, then who cares? I mean, have you seen the movie Everything, Everywhere, All at Once?
No, I've heard of it, but I haven't seen it.
I hated it so much.
I mean, I think that's why I didn't watch it, because I thought I wasn't going to like it.
Yeah. So Everything, Everywhere, All at Once. I'm happy I watched it, though, so I could connect with like the culture and the reasons for its popularity. But the movie basically boils down to the idea that if nothing matters, then we just might as well just enjoy everything that we have in life.
Yes, exactly. That's kind of how I would view it.
Yeah. So how do you think that coexist with does that connect to the idea that there's a lot of liberty with nihilism as well, a lot of freedom?
Yeah, I mean, freedom in the modern sense of the word freedom. Yeah, in the pure sense of being able to basically do whatever you want, which I would argue this is a discussion for another time. I would argue that's a misunderstanding of the word freedom, but that is kind of how the modern sense of freedom, I think, is put about. So yeah, exactly. I think there's a lot of liberty in that sense. And I guess I would say, yeah, I mean, I think I agree. I think I would, but generally I would probably say the nihilist is pursuing pleasure and or even power. Like, now granted, I'm happy to have you correct me on this, or my friend Father Luke, or someone else if they're listening, because I am not a Nietzschean philosopher by any means. But there is the famous philosopher Nietzsche from the late 1800s, I think it was, who I feel like my vague understanding of him is that in some ways he almost falls into this category. He's not a nihilist himself, I don't think, but some of his things kind of border on what we're talking about in the sense of this pure pursuit of power. He talks about the Übermensch in German, which is like the Superman, basically, like the man who just rules with power over everything in his life, and the pursuit of pleasure as being kind of, these are like the things of life. Like, and they're not, it's not that that's the reason you're living. It's simply that, to your point about the nihilist not really having a reason, it's not really that that's the reason you're living in like the purest sense. It's more like just, well, since you're in this world anyway, you should just try to be the best and have the most things you can and have the most pleasure and all those things. That's kind of, I don't know, that would be one of my thoughts with that.
See, this is where nihilism, the difference between nihilism and existentialism confuses me.
Okay.
Because I've only read one book from Nietzsche. I have a few copies of his other works, like The Genealogy of Morals and The Beyond Good and Evil. But
yeah, which, to be clear to everyone, I would not recommend you go read Nietzsche.
Really?
Not for the average person.
Okay. Wow.
I think philosophers or theologians could handle that, but because I think it's too depressing in a certain sense for the average person and confusing.
Here's what how much Nietzsche have you read?
Not much.
Okay. So I will admit I've only read The Antichrist. I think I've read portions of The Genealogy of Morals, believe it or not, at Franciscan, but it was more from like a critical approach. I remember the first time trying to read The Antichrist, I think I was trying to read The Genealogy of Morals. I wasn't like in the greatest headspace. I was kind of in a dark place already. Mm-hmm. And then I started reading it and I had to put the book down. I was like, whoa.
Yeah, that's kind of my point.
So, but I don't want, I would almost say I would suggest reading Nietzsche as long as you're in a good headspace.
Yes, sure. But I guess that's kind of what I'm saying, is that I feel like the average person is maybe not prepared for that, or not in the best. I also would argue that, sorry, not to sidetrack us too much, but I would argue that like, I think it would be more beneficial to read Aristotle and some other more classic philosophers first, at least. I think that's my point, is that I'm thinking of like the average person I know nowadays has not really read much philosophy at all. And so if they were to just pick up a book by Nietzsche and read it, I think it would be very confusing to them.
I think that's a great point, actually. Yeah. And so
that's more what I'm getting at, because you and I have both had some philosophy and theology like training in our lives. And so it's easier for us to have that backing.
I think, honestly, regardless of those who are listening, regardless of your opinion on what we are saying about whether or not you should read Nietzsche or the other existentialists or nihilistic philosophers, even if you think, no, I should be able to read whatever I want, 100% you should be able to read whatever you want. But if you want to understand them, you need to start with the Greeks.
Yeah.
That doesn't necessarily mean you need to read every piece of their work. You don't even maybe need to read an entire book of theirs, but you do need to come to an understanding of their general ideas, I would argue. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think my only thing I would add to that too is actually, I think if it helps at all for people out there, most of the modern philosophers like Nietzsche were well-read people themselves. Mm-hmm. And so they had that foundation themselves before they even wrote their own stuff. So it's, I think it's important to realize the context of what you're reading and who you're reading and all that. Yeah, but anyway, yeah.
Yeah, Nietzsche wouldn't make any sense, I think, if you didn't understand Aristotle's philosophy, especially his Nicomachean Ethics, where he talks about the good, but then Nietzsche's critiquing that very idea of the good. Yeah, so exactly. That's an excellent point that you made.
Yeah, so sorry, getting back to existentialism versus nihilism.
The only book of his that I've read is The Antichrist, and I read it with my students in Denver, and they actually had a really good time reading it. And not in the sense of ooh, look at us, we're reading Nietzsche, and I think I'm going to abandon my Catholic faith. I think they were were like reading it were like, wow, this guy's nuts.
That's good.
Yeah, but at least I hope that's what they were thinking. But with I think the Antichrist, correct me if I'm wrong, whoever's listening or whatever, or maybe you if you know, but I think the Antichrist is his last written work. I think one could argue that the Antichrist is Nietzsche in his like final form. Because I remember teaching on the Antichrist or teaching Nietzsche's The Antichrist, and he defines the good as that which is powerful, or that which gives you power. But this little high school drama when I was teaching in Denver. I had a coworker of mine who taught a class, and he covered Nietzsche as well for just a general teaching of Nietzsche. And he was asking his students, what does Nietzsche define the good as? And one of my students who had me raise his hand, and he says, Mr. Gadbois says it's that which is powerful, which isn't really what I said. I just literally pointed to the book and said, no, Nietzsche literally says right there that.
Isn't it great when kids? Yeah.
Mr. Gadbois said, I'm like, I just pointed at the book. I just pointed at what he said. But my coworker was like, no, Nietzsche says that which is good is that which is noble. And I was like scratching my head, and I was like, okay, maybe he says that in the genealogy of morals, which I would argue is probably his like, not magnum opus. He has a bunch of other really significant works, but that's definitely the one where he's talking about morality, right and wrong, and where it originates from. But what point was I trying to make? The idea of good, Nietzsche, noble. Yeah, it seems that Nietzsche probably changed throughout his life, possibly.
Oh yeah,
that's what I thought about
for sure.
You know, maybe, and I don't really know what he means by Nietzsche saying that which is good is that which is noble. I would have to look deeper into that. But with the Antichrist, I think that's Nietzsche in his final form. And he said, yeah, that which is good is that which is powerful. Okay. Yep. And he doesn't mention his theory of the Übermensch explicitly, but you can tell it's definitely in his mind when he's writing the Antichrist. Because in the Antichrist, he talks about good men are the ones who are powerful, obviously, because good is that which is powerful. And to be powerful, you must rise above morality. You don't subscribe to the ideas of good and evil that the world has told you, that your parents raised you with, that your community, that your religion raised you with. Yep. No, you decide for yourself what is good and what is evil. And that is consistent with what you were sharing, the theory of the Übermensch, the Overman, the Superman. The Superman does not listen to people. He decides for himself what is good and what is evil. And it's kind of what happens in Crime and Punishment. Have you ever read Crime and Punishment?
I haven't. That's a good book. But
yeah. No, it's definitely worth a read. But Dostoevsky is always like a heavy... He's surprisingly, even though he's not modern, even though he's a little bit older in his writing, it still translates very well to today. You're not reading this where like, oh, I need to like listen. I need to read very slowly. Dostoevsky, you can actually read fast. Like he's just a good writer. He's good at telling stories. The dialogue is not finicky. It makes sense. But Raskolnikov, the main character in Crime and Punishment, he subscribes to that idea that he is above morality. And not necessarily that he thinks he just wants to be above morality. His hero throughout the entire book of Crime and Punishment is Napoleon, because Napoleon was a man who, when he saw something that needed to be done for the good of the people, or what he himself thought was good and better for the world, he did it. He didn't care what the consequences were. He said, "I'm going to do this because I am a great man, and I rise above what society tells me, and I do it because I myself know it is good, or I decide for myself what is good." Raskolnikov wants that. And it's crazy because I'm pretty sure Dostoevsky predates Nietzsche. Yeah, he does.
Yeah, he definitely does, yeah.
And Dostoevsky is already talking about basically the theory of the Übermensch and Crime or Punishment before Nietzsche's really writing about it, which I think is quite fascinating. It's weird to have the theory come after it was criticized and gained popularity. And I thought it was criticized very well in Crime and Punishment. But see, I don't know how that differs. Like, would we call this idea the Übermensch? Would you call that a nihilistic idea or an existentialist idea?
Can you give me a definition of what you would think of as an existentialist?
Good. So we define nihilism.
Yeah.
So nihil, okay, is a Latin word that literally means nothing. Yeah.
Correct.
So nihilism is nothingism in the most colloquial sense, the simplest form. So nothingism. Existentialism is this idea in which you create your own meaning. There's no set meaning necessarily for humanity, but you yourself are this self-made individual. Like the existentialist philosopher who I think of is Jean-Paul Sartre.
Oh yes, of course.
Yeah. And he teaches about this idea in his book. I've only read one of his books, Existentialism is a Humanism.
I think that's the one I've read too, actually.
Yeah. And in that book, he talks about how, what did he say? He says being follows act. Being follows act.
Yeah.
Being follows action, which is a fancy way of saying what you do makes you who you are.
Correct. Yeah.
Which is accurate to a certain extent.
To a certain extent.
If you steal something, you are a thief. You know what I mean?
Well,
Your actions make you
even
who you are.
that though, that doesn't speak to. I think that's where the failing in Sartre's logic is, and kind of the drawback is that doesn't speak to who you are deeply. That speaks to
exactly,
like an
100%.
aspect about you.
Right. Yeah.
And that's where you get into we'd get into the philosophy of what it means to have, the aspects of someone versus who they are in the deepest sense. But
right. Yeah. No, I agree 100%. But so I just wanted to I didn't want to come off as I was completely criticizing Sartre because I totally understood what he was saying. I'm like, yeah, that makes sense.
No, yeah, it does.
But the person who's like, if the person who commits a crime and all they are is this murderer, that means they're irredeemable. But I refuse to accept that idea. You know what I mean? I choose to accept the idea that there's something else there, worth saving. Definitely.
For sure.
So what is existentialism? Sartre says your actions make you who you are. Okay. So your action determines who you are. Your actions determine what your goal is in life, your purpose, your meaning, and you decide that for yourself. That's what I've understood existentialism to be. What is your...
No, I mean, that sounds right to me. I think this has been helpful for me even actually to kind of clarify some of these terms a little bit in my own understanding of them. I think in that way of looking at the two of nihilism versus existentialism, I think I would tend to say that Nietzsche's ideas are much more along the existentialist line of thinking. I think this is classic. This happens to all of us at times. I think what was happening in a sense is that I'm reading my own, I don't know if I want to say it that way. I'm putting my own thoughts and almost correcting nihilism before even just defining it in a sense. Because I think my argument would be that it's not possible for a human to live without desiring to without trying to pursue something.
Yeah.
And so therefore, when we were talking about nihilism just now, I was kind of putting that on the nihilist. But I think in the strictest understanding of nihilism, in the proper sense, it really would just be that simple, pure nothingness in a certain sense of really there is no meaning. And so there is no reason to pursue these things other than just, that doesn't necessarily mean the nihilist might not be pursuing pleasure or whatever else, but they're not doing it because they're trying to, make themselves whatever through that, which I think that's the difference between the two, that the existentialist, to your point, is profoundly trying to, it's almost like a form of relativism, I would say, in a certain sense, the existentialist of I'm going to define who I am, what makes me happy, what I do, all these things through my own actions, through my own pursuit of things, versus I think in nihilism, there's just not even that. There's not even the point of I'm not even going to define this because I don't need to.
Yeah. I mean, more relativism, which is the idea that you decide for yourself what is good and what is evil, is clearly a natural consequence of existentialism and is actually almost, you could argue, synonymous with existentialism.
Yeah, exactly.
But you are right in pointing out the difference. Nihilism is there is no good, there is no evil.
Exactly.
You know what I mean? Which see, here's the thing. I would be happy to be corrected by this. First of all, there's two things I want to say. One, the confusion that you share with differing between nihilism and existentialism, I feel. Because before I read Nietzsche, I was always told he's a nihilist. He's a nihilist, or he teaches nihilism or writes about it. And and like I said, I've only read the Antichrist, but I'm familiar with his theory of the Übermensch. His most popular theory, and I'm just that is not a nihilistic philosophy whatsoever. The Antichrist is not a nihilistic book. It's 100% existentialist because it is the self-made man, the self-made individual. That is 100% existentialism. But when you made the comment, there's not really you made this comment. I don't think there are really any true nihilist out there. You didn't say that, but you basically did.
Basically say that earlier,
but you did basically say that because no one can live without purpose.
Yeah.
And you could argue without getting too dark, but I'm going to because there's no other way to really say this, is that the culmination of nihilism is the ending of one's life.
Mm-hmm.
Because if there's no point to anything, then what am I doing? Nothing. So I might as well be nothing. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Nihilism. I don't, the way I describe the difference between nihilism is nihilists are people who don't believe in anything greater out there. There's nothing out there. And existentialists are people trying to create meaning in a world in which they don't believe there is anything greater out there. Because an existentialist is trying to create individual meaning for themselves. But if you subscribe to the idea that everyone has their very own meaning, it's like, and maybe this is the wrong way to describe existentialism, but I always think of The Incredibles. You've seen The Incredibles?
Yeah, of course.
Do you remember Syndrome?
Yeah.
That troll doll of a supervillain. There's this one line, like sometimes Disney, like as much as I can't stand it, every once in a while, they just nail it on the head with like a quote. There's the quote that Syndrome shares when he has the whole Incredible family, Mr. Incredible, his wife and kids, and he has them captured. Mm-hmm. And he's explaining to them his evil plot, and he's being ridiculed by Mr. Incredible. And Syndrome, he goes on this monologue, and he's like, I'm gonna be super. I'm gonna have all these tools, these devices that I've created to make me powerful. And when I'm old and I've had my ways, I'll sell all my stuff so everybody can be super. And when everybody is super, no one will be. And I am like, well, what is? I remember that being as a kid, I was like, what is he talking about? Like, no, everyone will be super. But as I've gotten older, the idea of being super is having something that others don't. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? So when Syndrome says everyone will be super, then no one really will be a superhero. There will be no one above anyone else when it comes to powers, when it comes to potential. So it's kind of boring. You know what I mean? So with existentialism, it's like everybody has their own individual meaning. But if everyone has their own meaning in life, then is there really any authentic meaning to life? Like, I'm not sure if those two connect, but I feel like deep down inside they do. Because if you say, is there purpose to existence? And you were to answer, yeah, everyone has their own existence or their own purpose for existence. And I would think to myself, so there's no actual purpose to existence. There's just
exactly. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
See, that's what I'm saying. Like,
that's where you get to the relativism thing that like, if purpose is defined by the individual, then in a certain sense, how does it even become purpose at that point? Because then it just means that it's all up to each person individually.
Yeah, and then therefore there's nothing to also unify humanity, which is a problem, especially when there's a lot of conflicts going on because everyone has their own goals, their own agendas. Because that's why when you said we were talking about the relationship between existentialism and nihilism, we were talking about how existentialism leads to or is like consistent with moral relativism, and nihilism is the idea that there's no such thing as good or evil. But honestly, I don't see the difference between the two. Because if we apply that Syndrome case to morality and say, is there such a thing as right or wrong? And you say, no, right or wrong is just relative to the person. You're like, oh, so everybody's right in their own way. And you're like, exactly. And I'm like, well, if everybody's right, then no one is.
Exactly.
Yeah. It's like if 2 + 2 = 4, but we're like, nah, 2 + 2 = what you say it is. And I'm like, so there is no right answer? It's like, no, everyone has their own right answer. I'm like, but that means no one has the right answer.
Well, exactly. I mean, this gets me to like, sorry, this is going to be a really funny reference, but there's this great line that my brothers and I have always loved commenting on from, if you've ever seen the prequels of the Star Wars movies.
I love those.
Revenge of the Sith.
I will admit.
I'm not a huge prequel person, but they're all right. They're fun. They're
fun. Yeah.
But the dialogue is awful in a lot of those movies.
For sure.
And in Revenge of the Sith, when Anakin and Obi-Wan are facing off to have their lightsaber duel that leads to Anakin becoming Darth Vader, there's this great line where they're like hurling like insults and phrases back and forth at each other a little bit. And Obi-Wan says to Anakin the phrase, only a Sith deals in absolutes.
Can I be honest? I've never understood why he says that.
Well, think about the logic. You know logic, I'm sure. You've had some training in
yeah.
logic. Think about the logic of that phrase. What does it mean? There has to be one of two conclusions from that phrase.
Only a Sith deals in absolute.
Guess who just said that?
A Jedi.
So what does that mean? That means either the phrase is true and Obi-Wan himself is a Sith, or the phrase is not true. Because it's an absolute phrase. He says only a Sith deals in absolutes. He just used an absolute.
Yeah. And he's obvious. Yeah, he would be contradicting himself.
So he's either saying something that's just stupid and untrue, or he's a Sith. But the point that I'm getting at with that was a little bit of a tangent.
That's
but
all
my
good.
point is to relate to your thing about relativism in a sense that like it's a similar thing in some sense that it almost like relativism almost turns in on itself because it becomes this thing of like, well, if you have your good and I have my good, well, but there is no good. But then to say that there is no good is an absolute statement.
Oh, 100%, yeah.
And so therefore, that would imply that there must be some absolute that makes you certain that there is no good or that there is no absolute.
I feel really bad. I play that trick on my students all the time when I'm doing.
Well, that's probably good. They probably need to learn it, right?
No, they'll be like, we'll be talking about right or wrong. And they'll be like, well, that's just their own culture. Like, there's really no such thing. Like, there's no real right or wrong. It just depends on how you've been raised. And I'm like, so there's no such thing as right or wrong. Like, there's no real true answer. They're like, right. I'm like, so is that true? And they'll be like, yeah.
Do they start to realize that what you're getting at? They realize like, oh shoot, if I say yes, then I'm declaring a statement.
Some of them pick up on it. Yeah, 100%. Like I had a student this past like a month or two ago, about 2 months ago, he was giving me a hard time in a friendly case. Mm-hmm. Like we were seminaring and he brought up the idea of there being one true God. Oh, no, I brought up the idea. I'm obviously bringing up the idea of there being one true God, but he's like, how can you go around acting like you're right and everyone's wrong, basically, you know? And I just looked at him. I'm like, do you think that opinion that you hold is right? Like, do you think that the idea that it is wrong to criticize other belief systems, do you think that, sorry, I need to speak clearly. The idea that it is wrong to criticize other people's belief systems, do you think that's a true statement? You think it's true that it is wrong to correct others and criticize others? And he's like, yeah. I'm like, well, you think that is right. Just like I think that there is one God, you know, like you and I are basically in this, no, we're not in the same team, but we're subscribing to the same idea.
It's the same concept. It's working with an absolute, basically. It's working with there is a definitive right or wrong to this. That's what that person is saying in their logic.
This has definitely turned into not just an explanation of nihilism and existentialism, but a criticism of nihilism and existentialism, which I feel bad about. I mean, obviously, as Catholics, we do not subscribe to nihilism or existentialism whatsoever.
No, but we were initially. You're right. I do feel a little bit bad about that too. But it's hard to, yeah.
Well, no, yeah, 100%. And maybe for those of you who are listening, you could be thinking, oh, they said they were going to explain them, and now they're just like attacking them. Sure, that's kind of what happened, but you also have to look at this as more of like a discussion of these ideas. Like rarely can you just define something and then just be like, okay, that's the definition, we're good to go. It's like no, like when you define something, you feel this like inner compulse, like.
Well, yeah, I think it would be almost like negligent to simply
not further define
something and then say that's what it is. Have fun, like because you need to at least kind of explain it more. And granted, I think I guess my way of looking at it is like I would be happy to have. I don't know how you feel about this, but like I would actually be open to having an existentialist
for sure
on the show and talking to them about it and seeing what their thoughts are. Like I would be open to that. So I'm not trying to like take a crap on it. It's more just like you're saying, we're just discussing it, and we both, I think, in a certain sense, part of this is we're both trying to understand them better too. And in that, we like end up thinking about our own backing and philosophy and theology and training and all of that. But I think it's partially just to try to understand, like, these are what these things are. And I guess it's the other thing of what are the implications of that? Because it's not simply just defining it and then you say, well, there's the definition. Well, okay, there's a definition, but what does that mean? What is the implication of that definition?
Yeah, I agree. It's, this is just more of a discussion, and we're talking about these ideas. And yeah, we're not just going to share the definition and not discuss its implications 100%. Yeah, and like when I think of moral relativism, okay, this idea that there's no right or wrong, and I say, so you think that there's no idea or there's no true answer, there's no right or wrong, and they're like, right. I'm like, you just contradicted yourself. You said there's no right or wrong, and you said that statement is true, that is right. And it's like, okay, well, you contradicted yourself there. Like, that's such a simple argument that I still don't understand how relativism is popular. So I think to myself automatically, there's got to be a better argument for relativism, because it is so easy to logically dismantle based off of that fact. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
It's like, because more relativism, like even at the Catholic schools I've taught at, dominates the mind of my students.
So, I mean, this gets into like, I don't want to go too far down this rabbit hole, but in some sense, this is a little bit of also, I think, why we wanted to do the podcast on some level is to me, that speaks to what I would consider to be a deeper, I mean, personally, I would call it a deeper problem of the world today, is that I think a big part of that is just the fact that most people don't have any formal training in philosophy or logic or any of that as kids. Like we grow up, and I mean, I grew up that way too. I imagine you probably grew up similarly in some ways that like, I mean, I guess, well, yeah, without getting into that, but like, but still, I grew up at least on some level having kind of a relativistic view of the world until I started studying philosophy and theology and understanding like, how does logic work on a basic level? Like, what does it mean to, like, what is logic and what is thinking and what is philosophy and the fact that there is a philosophy behind everything that people believe, whether they acknowledge it or not.
Right. No one's walking around like, I'm an existentialist, I'm a nihilist, or like, no one thinks like that really, except those who have degrees, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And sip on coffee and make frappuccinos. But like, yeah, but you're right, 100%.
But yeah, sorry, I guess my point is that like, I think, I think that's part of why you see that a lot with your students is because, I mean, granted, again, I'd be happy to have someone come on and argue relativism with us. But to me, a big part of that today is just the fact that I think the average person out there doesn't see how that argument works necessarily because they're just not trained in it at all. Like you doing that to your students is probably the first time that most of them have had somebody do that.
Yeah, like this is one of my biggest critiques of modern education, even in the Catholic schools, is we don't do a logic course. Yep. We don't teach kids how to think. I can't tell you how frustrated I get when I grade and read my students' papers, which I don't assign very many because I can't handle it. Yeah, I get way too mad. And fortunately, for my own sanity, I've come to accept the fact that I can't necessarily blame them because no one's taught them how to think for themselves. Kids have schools, we've just been teaching them to know things, not understand.
Without understanding or thinking.
Yeah, and I mean, understanding should be like the go-to way to teach because understanding, it makes memory 10 times easier.
Yep.
You know, we're like leaning too hard on the concept of memorization and not an understanding, and it would just make everything so much simpler. But yeah, I mean, maybe that has something to do with it, the reason for the popularity of relativism and existentialism. But also, I think existentialism and relativism is a lot less offensive.
Oh, sure. Yeah. You mean in like the modern sense of upsetting people in a certain sense that like it's a lot easier to say, well, you know, actually, yeah, that's true. It's also more, it's less offensive and it's easier, I would say too, in a certain sense in so far that it's less, I guess this is similar to the offensive thing, but like, you can kind of say, you know, in moral relativism, obviously you can say like, well, you know, you believe that, I believe this. Well, as long as we're not like hurting each other, that's okay. Yeah. And that leaves a lot less. You don't have to argue with people as much. You don't have to, you know, in the truest sense of moral relativism, you don't have to argue with people as much. You don't have to, you know, defend things as much because you can just kind of say, well, all right, that's what you believe. I believe this. Like
conflict averted.
Yeah, exactly.
And you actually made this comment earlier that all I think is based off of, like with the founding of America, this value of freedom just blossomed throughout the world. And as you were talking about earlier, is there's a modern understanding of freedom that doesn't exactly coexist with what true freedom is. Yeah. Freedom, the modern understanding of freedom is the ability to do whatever one pleases. But is a drug addict truly free? Is an addict to anything truly free? Mm-hmm. No, they are completely enslaved to the thing that they have freely chosen to do. You know, like some people might look at the idea of like, oh, I'm married and I have kids, I'm tied down, I can't do what I want. it's like, fine, go do those things and see how free you actually feel. Like, you'll feel pretty sad after that. So yeah, there's these different understandings of freedom. And I think with that, because of the confusion of what true freedom is, relativism naturally dominates the playing field, unfortunately.
I would agree.
But I'm happy to be corrected. I don't think that my mind would ever be changed on relativism. I mean, I can be sympathetic towards it. I totally get it. Like I like,
for sure. That was part of my point about it being easier in a sense. So like, it's not fun to have to like argue with people or defend your faith or defend your aspects, your views on things. That's not fun. I don't.
100%. Yeah.
I mean, even though I enjoy discussing things, I still don't find it fun because of the tension that's there.
Like, I think I remember Chesterton, like it's a paraphrase and I believe it came from him. I'm not sure, but Chesterton says something along the lines of, I'm not a Christian because it's easy. I'm a Christian because I think it's true. And I heard that and I'm like, 100%. Like, it'd be so easy not to be Catholic.
Yep.
Oh, don't need to go to confession. Sick. I can sleep in on Sunday. Awesome. You know what I mean? Exactly. And all these other things that I am supposed to do, but I don't want to, I don't believe things to be true because it's easy, but although I understand why people do believe things because they're easy. Like, the world's a messy place. You want to throw more conflict into my life by believing in something, but ironically, believing in something actually makes you more calm. So I think we've.
Yeah. So I was going to say, do you want to give a brief kind of definition of nihilism and existentialism, and then move on to the third one? Yeah.
So nihilism, nothingism, the idea that there is no reason, no purpose. There's nothing. There's no why to our existence.
Yeah.
And therefore we just do whatever we want. And some would even conclude that nihilism reaches its peak in suicide. And I've read forums where people who were nihilist and they're like, I just couldn't do it. I couldn't be a nihilist. It was just way too dark. I had to like establish some meaning in my life. So I think nihilism eventually runs out. And then there's existentialism, which I think is the most popular worldview, especially in the Western world, believe it or not, where you create your own meaning, which is a very liberating also idea. I can understand, because people, like, you're your own person, you're your own man, you're your own woman. You get to do what you want to do, and what you do makes you who you are, as Sartre says. So yeah, nihilism, there's no reason for existence. Existentialism is you create your own meaning.
Yep.
Yeah. Now, the third one that we've decided to call it theism, which theo is the word for God in Latin, correct? Yep. Goodness. So theo, the word for God in Latin. Theism is an idea in which you subscribe to a belief.
Well, it's actually the word for God in Greek, but...
Greek, okay, not Latin.
Yeah, because
Latin is deum.
Deus is Latin.
Yeah, which deism is actually is a type of theism. I know it gets confusing.
Yeah, but theism is the Greek.
Theism is Greek, yeah.
Well, theos is the Greek for God.
Yes, because Theophilus is loved by God. Yeah,
exactly.
That's Greek. Okay, so theism is the idea that there is a God out there. Honestly, in like the most simple form. Or gods.
A god or gods.
Yeah, because polytheism is like a subcategory of theism.
Correct, which is just poly is just the word to mean many. So.
Right. And in most theisms out there, other than deism, which I'll define here in a second, theism is basically, behind all theisms, is the idea that God exists, that God made us, and the purpose of our existence is to serve this God.
Okay.
What do you think of that? Like with Christianity, it's obviously to know, love, and serve God.
Yeah, I mean that's straight out of the Baltimore Catechism. But
right.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what most theism religions I think would believe that, or most people who are Well, I think most religions that are based on theism would say that. I don't know if I would say that. I don't know if if theists would necessarily say that, because I think you could be a theist insofar that you quote unquote believe in God, but not necessarily have a sense of having those three things of like being created to know that God and to, somehow serve that God or to be in union with that God or gods or whatever.
What else would there be? Like, cause like all I can think of is deism, which teaches that a God made us, but he doesn't care about us. He doesn't really have an impact on our lives anymore.
I guess that's maybe more what I'm thinking of is like I would say that like some of the modern theists out there nowadays or maybe they're what you're defining as a deist. And I haven't heard that before. I believe you. I just didn't know that phrase. I kind of like it actually, but
Yeah.
it's an easier way to define it. But of like, I guess some of the people I would think of as modern theists would be almost more like deists in the sense that like they believe that like there's a God, but like that doesn't really matter that much to them. It's like, well, there's a God. I think there's probably a God up there, and maybe he impacts the world somehow every now and then, but like doesn't really have much to do with my like daily existence.
Yeah.
That's more what I was getting at.
Yeah. And I think I can't think of any religion though that actually teaches that.
No, exactly. That was my point. My point was that I think
I see.
the major religions in general would teach what you described as the theist, but then there are some people out there who call themselves theists, who are maybe more like what you're defining as a deist, but they're more just kind of that person who's like, well, I believe in a God or gods or whatever, but I'm not sure what if they matter, you know?
Yeah, 100%. Or they even give me purpose, because you could theoretically be a deist and then also an existentialist, or even a nihilist. You know what I mean? Like the gods made us and they don't care, and when we die, that's it. So there really actually is no meaning to life. So theism.
Yeah.
I mean, I think we can push aside deism.
Yeah. For now, let's focus on theism.
Yeah. Theism, whether or not it's Christian or polytheist, because you can see the idea, like with the Greeks
and the Romans,
the Romans and the Egyptians and the Norse, like maybe the gods aren't loving, nor are they omnipotent, omnibenevolent, but nonetheless, the humans exist to serve the gods, right?
Yeah, no, that's true. Yeah,
yeah, and Christianity. Judaism differs a little bit from that in the sense. I mean, obviously, it differs
from which.
Obviously, the nature. Yeah, obviously, the nature of the gods or God differs drastically in Christianity, in Judaism,
and Islam. I mean, the three Abrahamic religions all share that kind of. Because they all came from Abraham, they all share that concept of the God.
Yeah, the one true
God who is. You know, above all, and I think all of them I will admit, I don't know what, actually, I did take a course on Judaism, Islam, and Christianity in college, but I don't, you know, I wouldn't put myself forward as a scholar of Islam or Judaism, but my understanding of those on a somewhat cursory level is that they are very similar to Christianity in that sense of that belief in like, in some varied in different ways for each religion, to know, love, and serve God in different, you know, whatever capacity that means in the different religions. Like that's the phrase we use in the Catholic Church, but like there's different ways that's gone about, I think, but I would argue that all three of them kind of have that general concept.
Yeah. I mean, definitely with Judaism, with the Shema, do you remember the Shema? Hear, O
Israel, the Lord, our God is Lord alone.
Yes. I think
therefore you shall love the Lord your God with your whole heart, soul, mind, and strength.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. Which is consistent with the Christian idea of to know, love, and serve God.
Yeah,
right. Islam, I know a lot of people describe the monotheistic view of God, the popular ones, as that view of God. They describe him as the Judeo-Muslim Christian God. I struggle to accept that. Like when I explain to my students ideas of God, I'll say the Judeo-Christian God. I do not say the Judeo-Muslim Christian God because Allah, the Islamic understanding of God, that's what they call him, Allah, which just means doesn't mean father, it just means God. There's some differences with him compared to the God of Christianity and the God of Judaism, from my understanding, such as his relationship to being all loving and all powerful. Like with Christianity, omnibenevolence, which is all loving, omnipotence, which is all powerful, coexist within God. But with Islam, from my understanding, the idea of God being all good isn't necessarily prominent in Islam, because God is almost beyond good and evil in Islam. He is not bound by morality, because that would threaten his omnipotence. Because omnipotence, I think...
Have you...
Because I know there's multiple schools of thought.
I guess Islam. I'm curious, like, where have you...
I heard this in
What
my
is your like studying on this? What is your kind of?
I heard it. Yeah. So my authority, my ethos for this is in my undergraduate program at Franciscan. And it was a comment in the past because we were just going over Aquinas's 5 proofs for God's existence.
Yeah.
Which St. Thomas Aquinas, is saying too, was a philosopher.
So you haven't like read like a translation of the Quran or anything like that?
I have a copy of the Quran, but I have not read a translation of the Quran. But there is...
Which I haven't either. I want to... To the same point that we made earlier at one point, like I want to be fair to Muslims, and like I hesitate because that is a thing that I've heard many people and many Christians in our world will kind of, in my view, kind of take a crap on Islam almost or whatever of like, well, the Jewish religion, they have the same concept of God as us pretty much, but the Muslims, it's just very different, and they have that, and maybe it's a little bit like Protestantism insofar that like there are definitely different interpretations of the Quran and different interpretations of what it means to live Islam. And so like, I guess that's my only hesitancy is to be cautious of making that sort of claim without having like actually read it. And like I said, I haven't either, but without having kind of read up enough on it. Like I've read enough, we've both read the Hebrew scriptures because the Jewish Bible is the Old Testament of the Catholic Bible. And so, there's...
Make sure you're a bit closer to the mic.
Oh, sorry. There's a correlation there, but like I haven't read the Quran. I know what I learned in that class years ago, but I don't have a super well-formed understanding of that.
Yeah, and I'm mostly making this point as a discussion topic, first of all. And second of all, I'm not really saying it as a negative term. Okay. Like when I say, I don't really call the monotheistic opinion of God that Judaism, Christianity, and Islam share, I don't call it the Judeo-Muslim Christian God, because I just think, because I've heard people question that idea. So that's why I'm throwing it out there. I'm saying I don't know enough to call it the Judeo-Muslim Christian God. I 100% know that the God of Judaism and the God of Christianity are almost the same. Obviously, the Jewish people do not accept the idea of the Trinity, and they don't believe Jesus is God.
Jesus is not God.
Right. But Islam, I'm not calling it the Judeo-Muslim Christian God because I don't know. I'm kind of doing the opposite of what you're doing,
sure.
but for the same
reason.
Yeah. Okay. And it was a professor who told me this idea of God a professor who I respected. So I think I should look into it more 100%. But it was a credible source to me where, Allah is limited. And this is an objection to the Christian understanding of God that I've heard before. How can God be omnibenevolent and omnipotent? Because he's limited. If you're all powerful, you should be able to do whatever you want. But when you're omnibenevolent, it means you're all good and you can't do evil. Therefore, God's limited in what he can do.
Yeah.
Obviously, that's not a true limitation of power, because power is only fulfilled in doing that which is good. But I've heard some people argue that Islam does not believe in this all good, all loving concept of God. Not to say that they think God is evil either, but they just think God can do whatever he does to fulfill his will.
Sure, yeah.
That's obviously open for discussion 100%. And it wasn't a point to put Islam. It wasn't like, they're obviously wrong, because that was going back to Socrates, the Greek philosophers. One of the most popular dialogues that Plato wrote about Socrates was the Euthyphro dialogue. And then, are you familiar with the Euthyphro dialogue?
Yes, but it's been a while since
they basically read it, the story of Euthyphro is Socrates is showing up to the court, to the local courthouse, because he's been accused of corrupting the minds of the youths of Athens, the youth of Athens. And there's Euthyphro there, and Socrates is like, Euthyphro, what are you doing here? And Euthyphro says, my dad, can you believe him? He killed one of our servants. I think this is how the story goes. He's like, he killed one of our servants. Can you believe him? And I'm going to make sure he's imprisoned because of it. And Socrates is like, what? How could you condemn your own father? And he's like, because my dad did something unjust. He did something evil. And Socrates, I always read him as being sarcastic, but I think most people read him as being authentic, because Socrates hears that and he says, oh, Euthyphro, I struggle to understand that which is good and that which is evil. Make me your disciple and show me the way to that which is good. And Euthyphro takes him seriously. I always think Socrates is being sarcastic, but he's probably not. And Euthyphro's like, yeah, of course, I'll explain to you what is good and what is evil, and you can be my follower. And Socrates starts asking him all these questions. So he eventually gets to the question of what is just? Euthyphro, tell me, Socrates, what is just? And Euthyphro said, and he struggles, I think, to define it. But Socrates eventually asks the question, well, maybe there's a confusion as to what is just. Is something good because God wills it? Or does God will something because it's good?
Yeah.
You know, if something's good because God wills it, that means God can, like, what is good is arbitrary. It's constantly changing because it depends on what God wills that day, which I think is more representative of what Islam thinks about God. Now, the other idea, something is good because God wills it, that obviously doesn't add up, because that means that which is good is outside of God. And therefore, God isn't truly God at that point, because he isn't the creator of all things. He isn't the source of all things. Obviously, Christianity and Judaism, from my understanding, subscribe to none of those ideas. They subscribe to kind of this not middle ground. That's a misrepresentation of it. They subscribe to the idea that something is good because God wills something because he is good.
Correct.
God is goodness itself. Okay. Therefore, he's always going to be consistent with his morality, or morality itself. He's going to be... he's always going to make a decision in accordance with that which is good, because he himself is goodness itself. Yeah. It's not like he determines it because of what he feels like doing that day.
Yeah.
And maybe, I'm sure, see, here's the difficult thing about Islam. There's a book that I haven't finished, and I've started a couple times. It's called The Closing of the Muslim Mind. It's written by this man named Robert Riley, I believe. Okay. And I have a copy of it right now in my library. And he talks about how in the between the 8th and 10th century, Islam went under this radical change. Like, Christianity struggled with, should we accept the Greek philosophers and use them to supplement our theology? Or should we look at them as just pagans, and therefore everything they touched was just evil?
Yeah.
But clearly, like, with the church fathers and Aquinas, they're like, no, like, anything, like, just because you believe something wrong does not make everything else you think and teach wrong. Like, that's an ad hominem attack. Well, not necessarily an ad hominem attack, but it's a illogical way to discredit someone. Yeah. It's like, I don't agree with your immigration policy, therefore, your voting policy is like, everyone thinks that way, though.
Modern fallacy.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Like, everyone thinks that. It's ridiculous about everything. There's that way of thinking. But the Muslims went into that exact same kind of dilemma. It's like, should we accept these philosophers? Or, because, to give credit where credit is due, Islam has absolute devotion to the Quran, kind of like the Protestant Christians do, and I think the Catholics do. Although the Catholics maybe just don't understand as well, or at least some of them don't understand as well, like how much reverence we should show to the Holy Scriptures.
The Bible, yeah.
But the Catholics, like the priest, like, we walk into Mass holding up the gospel. You know what I mean? Like, that's what it's all about. What?
Yeah.
What?
Nothing.
Oh, okay. But Islam, they look at the Quran as like the word of Allah, and like equivalent to a law. Like, God's word is him. So therefore we need to show absolute reverence to it. And a lot of Muslims, the majority of them nowadays, subscribe to the idea that, guess what? We don't need anything else. God's word is final. Why would we need some other ideas out there that might accidentally taint it?
Yeah.
And so before the 8th and 9th and 10th century, Islam was actually open to the Greek philosophers. Like, there was a school of thought that was like, no, we'll use them to help us. And without the Muslims, I don't think we would have Aristotle anymore. I think he was lost a lot of his writings were lost for quite some time. But then when the Ottoman Empire spread and they came across these documents and they retranslated them, like, that's how the Catholic Church actually began to access them. So we have them to thank for that. Yeah. But eventually Islam cast most of them aside. Not all Muslims. Muslims are still using Aquinas' argument sometimes, but a lot of them were like, no, we don't need philosophy. We don't need philosophy to try and rationalize through these difficulties that we find in the Quran. And Robert Riley, his book basically argues that when the majority of Islam cast aside the Greek philosophers, and therefore the ability to rationalize the Quran, it led to an increase in radicalism.
Oh,
that's his argument.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. So that's kind of where I was coming at with, there's a different understanding of God, because a lot of Christian theology is supplemented by Greek philosophy.
Sure. Yeah.
And Islam used to be, but not so much anymore, from my understanding. That could have radically changed. And I know there's different sects of Islam. There's the Sunni, the Shiites, and I know those kind of break out into a little bit more. But I know the Sunnis make up the majority of Islam, I believe. But But when it comes to the three most popular ideas of theism out there, it's Christianity, Judaism, and Islam.
And Islam, yeah.
100%. Yeah. I think there's a William Lane Craig, you know who he is? Yeah, one of the greatest Christian apologists of the time, of our time. Someone asks him, how could you come to an understanding of the one true God? Like, how could you know which one is true? And he's like, well, honestly, you're really only left with three. He's like, once you use logic and metaphysics and other philosophies to come to the conclusion that there can only be one God and that this one God must be like this, he must be loving and powerful and all these things. You're really only left with Islam, Christianity, and Judaism.
Yeah.
You know, and that's why I think when it comes to theism, those are the only three really worth talking about.
Correct. Yeah. I agree.
Yeah. So how do you want to keep talking about them or?
Well, I mean, I think we should get a little further. I mean, we don't want to go too far, but I think we should get a little further into what we gave a lot of time to. We kind of just went on a little tangent about Islam, but like, I think we should give a little bit more depth of what theism is that we're talking about when we're talking about the three of nihilism, existentialism, and theism.
So what more do you think we should say about theism, or what would you like to say more about?
Well, I guess kind of what was the purpose of bringing up the three?
So the purpose of the three was to kind of simplify reality when it comes to what options do we have for finding the good. There's nihilism, which says there is no good. Existentialism, which says you create your own good.
And what does theism say?
Theism says there is a good, and it is a God or gods, but we're paying mostly attention to Islam,
yeah,
and Christian, Judaism. That this God is the good, and pursuing Him. That's how we achieve the good. Now, obviously, we'd have to ask the question of how do we pursue Him, and that's what
sure,
I guess we could say.
Those are things for another time. I think that's a good. Yeah, actually, I like that. Those three are a good kind of basis framework to work with.
Yeah. You think there's anything more? I mean, there's obviously more to say about theism, but do you think there's anything else we should say?
No, I think that's a good for now. Like I those are all things I'm inevitably will end up talking about in the future in different ways. But
yeah, no, I just think that's what reality is. I think those are our three options: nihilism, existentialism, and theism. You choose, you pick, and obviously, some could accuse us and possibly be right of straw manning a lot of opinions, whether or not we believed in those opinions or not, because
for sure
you throw in utilitarianism in there and you're like, well, which one does that subscribe to? Utilitarianism, the idea that which is good is determined by basically the majority, what benefits the majority, that's what's good, that's not a very Christian idea. It might coincide with some Christian opinions in certain situations, but it's in no way is consistent with all of Christianity or Judaism or Islam. It's more of an existentialist philosophy. That which is good is that which favors the majority. Okay. But existentialism is very individualistic. So,
well, I think utilitarianism primarily is pretty individualistic though, too, because the thing with utilitarianism, like you describe it as that which is good is what benefits the most. But at the same time, typically in my experiences of utilitarianism, who decides what benefits the most is primarily decided by the individual in a certain sense. Like it can sometimes be decided by groups, but like in another sense, it's often decided by the individual. The classic, I think we're not going to go down that road, but the great example of that is the classic, what is it called? The trolley problem. The trolley problem, in philosophy, which if anyone is interested, you can look up the trolley problem. That's a crazy thing that I don't think it's worth getting into right now in detail. But the point is that's kind of an example of where, in some sense, that's almost like an individualistic decision of utilitarianism in one sense, because it comes down to that individual deciding what's best for everyone.
Yeah. No, and to push back on that a little, I think when it comes to the modern utilitarians, like the everyday thinker, the everyday relativist, 100%, what you said is how they view utilitarianism. What satisfies my appetite? Like what is good for me? Because I myself am the majority experiencer in my life. But John Stuart Mill, who was one of the popular proponents of utilitarianism, he argued, I think, that someone who pursues that which is good for the majority, if he authentically does it, would be willing to lay down his life for the majority good. if they're a true utilitarian. Now, obviously, I think that differs with how modern people think about it. But to just give John Stuart
That's
Mill
fair.
some
Yeah,
credit,
I think that is more how he views it. Yeah.
And I would maybe some more academic utilitarians might think like that, or maybe they say they think like that. There's a lot of philosophers who say they think like that, but then live completely different lives.
Yeah.
Like most Christians, actually. But we're Christians. We're Christians because we know we're sinners, not because we think.
Yeah,
we're
exactly.
So, theism, existentialism, nihilism.
Yeah.
And I think these are the three options we've got. And they're worth unpacking, they're worth discerning. And I think it's helpful to think about reality like that because it just simplifies it in a world in which we think like there's so many options. Because like I said, with freedom, we like to think we can do whatever we want, but that becomes overwhelming eventually.
Yeah.
Eventually we almost want someone to tell us what to do. But when we simplify the options to three, it makes life a lot easier for us. Because we all want a happy life, right? Mm-hmm. Even the emos. Even those listening to My Chemical Romance want to be happy,
Yeah.
But how do we become happy? That's the real question.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of the goal of, one of the goals of this podcast in a sense is to see that question not exactly answered, because obviously we're not going to just simply answer it, but to maybe discuss that in a certain sense indirectly sometimes, and to just struggle with that throughout the time of what does it mean to live for the good? How do we become happy? And, I hope this won't sound too funny, but I would like to clarify for the people out there too, that I doubt that every podcast is going to be quite this, even though both of us have backings in philosophy and masters of theology and all that. When we start having guests and stuff, I don't think every podcast will be quite this high philosophy and theology.
I feel bad.
I feel like we ended up kind of launching into like a very philosophical discussion, which is good, but just, to let people know, it's almost like the way Pints with Aquinas started too, in the sense that like, he just started by reading the Summa and talking about all these complicated things, and then it became, more discussion. That I think once we get down to, this was kind of like the introduction to what this podcast is, who we are, what we're kind of, that are overarching, like when we talked about the top down versus bottom up thing, like I think in some sense just now we gave kind of a good perspective of the top of the pyramid in one sense of like, here are your kind of options. And then in a certain sense, a lot of the podcast going forward would probably be more on the basic level of how do we live these things? What does it mean to, like those are the undergird, like I guess what I mean, or maybe it is the bottom up actually, I don't know. It's hard to say because in a certain sense, maybe it's like these philosophies that we just described of nihilism, existentialism, and theism are almost like the underlying things behind a lot of the daily decisions that most people make today.
Oh, for sure.
Whether they realize it or not. Like sometimes people don't even realize it, but oftentimes people are making their decisions with one of these kind of philosophies, one of these kind of ways of thinking underneath what they're doing. And so I think that's where this ended up inadvertently, I think in a really good way, being a great like beginning to what we want to do with this podcast in a sense, to show people that this can be a chance to, here's the basic groundwork. Yes, maybe it is the groundwork, the bottom up. Here's the groundwork of where people go. And then as we start talking about these topics going forward about community and about life and what it means to, to live in the world and not of the world and all those different things, as we cover those topics, you can kind of keep these things in your head that we've talked about today of these different aspects and kind of place it, not that you have to place it in boxes or buckets, but you can kind of see a little bit of like, oh, like that thing might lean more toward nihilism, or that thing might lean more toward theism, or that thing leans more toward existentialism. And like, that's interesting. Like, and I mean, you as the listener can kind of do this as we're going forward.
Yeah. I think that was a great way to look at it. And I think we're going to learn as we go. Mm-hmm. We're going to make our adjustments. It's okay, I think, to stumble over a few things, but I think what matters is that we look at this as we're just here to chat. We're here to talk about these ideas. And like to just back up what Peter said. Yeah, I apologize if today got a little too academic, and I can't help it sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, we're both nerds, so.
Yeah. And we love talking about these ideas. Even if we weren't recording, I think you and I would be talking about this no
For
matter
sure.
what. But yeah, we're all trying to be happy. We're all trying to live a fulfilling life. And it's really difficult to do that nowadays when we're being told to do so many things and we just don't know what to do. And it's nice just to listen without any stress, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And we're definitely here to listen, even though we're the ones talking.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wonderful. Well, you think that's it?
Yeah. I mean, I think just, give those plugs of like, we're going to, this is the first episode, but as we go forward, we'll get some things set up with a website and email and all those different things. You guys can send us questions if you want to. Yeah. We'll definitely start having guests on pretty quickly here. So probably either the second or third episode, I'd imagine we'll have a guest on and be able to start doing that.
Dude, that'd be so much fun to have people on.
Yeah,
I'd love a third person to talk to.
Exactly.
Nothing against you, Peter.
No. I'm totally with you. I think it just helps the conversation. It gives the back and forth of us is good, but I think it helps facilitate, if I can say that word right, the conversation better. And I think it gives a lot of really good opportunity for good questions. Like I think today we both had good kind of questions for each other and good thoughts, but I think it can really, like going back to that story of how we got started, like when we were sitting there with Ken and he's just asking these questions and to give you all a little bit of a glimpse, like, and I don't want to get too much into this, but when we're recording this, actually, funnily enough, it'll come out way later, but when we're recording this, it's near Halloween. Yeah. One of the questions that Ken asked us was what our thoughts were as like Catholic Christian men on Halloween and how to approach that and stuff. And we had very nuanced takes, to be clear. We weren't black and white on that one way or the other. But the point is that like things as simple and as fun as that is the kind of things we want to get into, of just like, struggling with discussing. And I don't think we fully agreed either in the good sense of like, it's just a discussion. It's like, here's kind of my thoughts on this. Here's Rhys's thoughts on this. Here's, so that's the beauty of getting another person in here too. So just to give everyone that kind of preview that, keep listening. It'll be fun. Yeah.
There will be those episodes for the people who want to have the intellectual conversations or discussions. And then there will be those who I just want to have a conversation about should my kids watch Bluey or not?
Yeah, exactly.
Which they should, because Bluey is awesome. As of now, I want to be abundantly clear that is not a lifelong endorsement of Bluey.
As of the recording of this podcast,
yes, 2023 fall. Yeah. All right, wonderful. Well, we're looking forward to beginning this journey with you guys, getting to know people, fielding questions, and to always be curious and to try and get to the mountains.
Yeah, exactly. I think of that great phrase from Blessed Pier Giorgio Frassati of Verso l'Alto, that's to the heights, that as we go out through this podcast, let us get, climb those mountains as best we can.
Send it. All right. You guys take care.